Mary Adams. So glad to see you on Radio Evolve. Welcome.
Thank you, Thomas. It's wonderful to be here.
I know you since many years, and I know you as someone who is deeply engaged her whole life into kind of a if I may say so, spiritual quest and the pursuit of consciousness. At the same time, recently your engagement opened up to a new field, which is radical climate activism. And I thought it would be great to talk with you about the relationship between both. Because on one hand, the question of the evolution of consciousness, the opening of consciousness, the maturing of our soul and hearts is an important question also in these terrible, difficult times. And at the same time, the climate crisis keeps rolling and it's kind of accelerating every day. So this is the predicament that we are in. And just to start with, how did you change, if that's the case at all, direction in the engagement of your life to dive so deeply into climate activism? How did it come about?
Great, good question. It's interesting because I think right from the beginning, I would say that because a lot of people perceive me as changing course, and I see a sort of straight line through it all. And it's true what you said. Most of my life, from my very early 20s, were devoted to exploring the world of consciousness and how consciousness relates to culture, though. Because originally I was, as you know, I went to India because I felt that largely the culture I was living in was had a lack of purpose and meaningfulness and depth. And I was attracted, as many people were. So I spent many years there devoted to that and have pursued that most of my life, actually, most of my adult life. But for myself, Thomas, it's always been I've always wrestled, I guess, or with the question of what's the relationship with that with culture. And one of the reasons I was attracted to Indian philosophy and civilizational thought, which is what I studied, is because it does not make that distinction. The spirit is the guide driver of culture, originally the Dharma. So that's why I think I was attracted to that. And then we were both involved in, an intentional community that was also devoted to that. What's the role and value of spiritual values, spiritual awakening, spiritual understanding in its effect and potential for shaping culture, shaping new cultural strategies, policies, ways of being and doing, actually, in all kind of fields. And so I've always been attracted to those two together. I haven't seen them as separate. But I guess, very quickly in 2013, as you know, the intentional community, we were part of the organization, went into demise in quite a radical way. And I spent about 2 years, I guess, focused on that, looking into that, exploring that, what happened, why, etc. And then I think after that, 2015, I went back to India. And it was interesting. The people I met there had a spiritual base, but they were also they had a historical grasp. And they were wrestling with Indian culture today, how it could manifest its deeper spiritual values, but in a modern India context. But in the course of that, I was exposed to quite, I think, a wake up for me of the colonial background and being British, having British parentage, British ancestry. It made me begin to look at those historical factors in the world we're in now. So it started with that. And then that led to quite an intensive research and looking, exploring, and I began to look at our culture. And I think some of the things that drove me to India in the very beginning, I began to see that we, at this point, 40 years on, whatever, are looking at the consequences of that. So fast forward 2016, I began to be very aware of the the effects of some of modernity, some of the sides of modernity. And I'm not an anti-modernist, but I began to see that the impacts of that, and one of them being very much climate, was beginning to really dawn. And but to myself, all the way through, I was looking at that as being a far-reaching expression of something deeply, something that had gone astray at the heart of our culture, the soul of our culture, and of culture I'm part of, that's the sort of far-reaching expression of that. And anyway, I wanted to know more about it. And I knew it was a controversial topic. There's lots of thought about it. So I went and did 3 days with Al Gore, one of his immersions with scientists. And I learned a lot. And I realized this really is a meta crisis, a mega crisis. And I think, Thomas, just to say, one of the things that impacted me, that was three very intensive days with scientists from all over the world. And we learned a lot, but it was their heartbrokenness that really impacted me. I realized this is really real. These are hardcore academics who have done research for years, and they are heartbroken about what's happening. So it led that. And then fast forward again, I began to think about that in the terms of consciousness and the relationship to it, and etc., what we needed to do. And I began to give talks and started to write about it. And then in 2018, I came across a talk about our responsibility in these times. And I realized that here in Britain, at least, the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, there was very, very little at that time in the public arena, public awareness. The media didn't speak about it much. And that's when Extinction Rebellion began. So I participated in that to some degree, and I was sort of looking, to see what it was all about, and et cetera, et cetera. And, I got fairly involved in that, but I didn't get that involved. And it was, I didn't get arrested or anything, but I participated and I listened and I learned. And one of the things that really attracted me about that was nonviolent civil disobedience in the Gandhian tradition and the tradition of Martin Luther King. And I did a lot of workshops on that and the relationship between that and social transformation, because Gandhi, as you know, was a deeply spiritual person, as was Martin Luther King, and in a different way than maybe I've approached it. But I began to see that those movements actually had, those particular ones had a spiritual basis. So I threw myself into that. And then I can't remember, I think it was in 2019 it was in 2020. There was, things had gone a little quiet again. We'd had COVID, that's right, we'd had COVID, which was huge. And another manifestation of things that are, I think, gone wrong culturally and at a certain level. And so everything was understandably about COVID. We were all in lockdown. It was a very, very tough time for people, et cetera, et cetera. And there was literally the climate crisis, the meta crisis we're in, and the interlinking crises that I think stem from a deeper civilizational consciousness issue, just evaporated. They weren't visible at all. They weren't in the media. And then I attended a talk, and I just responded to this call for nonviolent civil disobedience. I was very impressed with the person who gave it. It made a lot of sense. It was very planned, very strategic, nonviolent in its nature, spiritual in its values. And so I participated, and it was quite a profound, had quite a profound effect on me, largely because of the culture between the people. It was a small group, and it was very targeted, really. We had a target to bring back the issue into public consciousness through the media in order to put pressure on our government here in Britain, which is quite small. Britain's a very small population, but part of the G20, to really try to bring change through that strand. Now, I just want to say from the beginning, I see radical, nonviolent civil disobedience as one strand in a tapestry of things that need to happen. So I began there. Yes.
Just to make some things clear and outspoken,
Mm.
You glued yourself to the highway.
Mm.
There's a lot of discussion, both in Britain, Germany, other countries, about this radical climate activism that is as disruptive as gluing oneself
Yes.
to the surface of a highway.
Mm-hmm.
You got arrested, you spent time in prison, you were waiting for trial. You're
Mm.
doing this all
Mm-hmm.
not as a kind of an accident of your activism, but as a specific orientation of your activism.
Right.
And there's something that you said in the sentences before that struck me immediately when you were talking about the scientists, and you used the word heartbrokenness.
Yes.
And there's one other fact that I just want to establish as an maybe shared assumption, basically that the climate crisis is beyond the point where the catastrophe is avoidable. There is something, however this catastrophe will look like, it will get worse, it will accelerate. It's basically, I'm not saying it's the end of the world, end of the time. I'm saying it will be a major human and global crisis that maybe we have not seen. And we as a species have to prepare for that. It's not about how we prevent it at this point. It's how we go through it at this point. And this is a question in many dimensions. It's a political, social, economical question, but it is also a spiritual question, because it will challenge us to the core.
Very much.
And that will reach also, let's say, our spiritual stamina, how we can deal with that.
Definitely.
Individually and collectively.
Definitely.
And I understand that you and the groups that you're involved in are trying to address exactly that. Do I understand this right?
Yes, I think you do. Because it's interesting, Thomas, because I agree with you. I feel it's inevitable. The breakdown is happening. I mean, look just at California recently. It's a huge state. We can look in lots of places now and see what you're talking about already happening, and it's only going to increase. I'm with you on that. What I think civil disobedience is, two things I want to say about that. The role it has in that, because I feel we have to continue. I think your latest magazine is devoted to regenerative agriculture, regenerative ways of organization, etc. Those things have to happen, because I think when the breakdown happens, we have to have templates that are driven by a shift in consciousness or an expression of that. Those need to happen. But meanwhile, we have a situation that is feeding the fire, so to speak. I agree, we're on a trajectory now that is pretty much unstoppable, but how that plays out, the degree it plays out, I think there's still room for amelioration on that, which is part of what civil disobedience is about, is doing that, because right now we have not had a shift at the heart of culture away from the spiritual values or lack of spiritual values that led us here. And we're obviously speaking in generalizations here, but it's a very long conversation. But so that's happening. And that means that where the money is, where the power is still very much tied to old systems of thinking and old value systems. That's still directing, and it's having a huge effect. And the clock is ticking. So that's happening. Meanwhile, there are an enormous, diverse array of things happening in culture, and from people, the way people think to the way they do agriculture, economic, all of those sectors. A lot is happening that's different. It's still on the periphery, or moving in, but it's still on periphery. We are still on the same track. So the kind of climate disobedience at the moment, the action, is to counter that, keep pushing that, keep saying this has to change, because that will, I believe, ameliorate some of the effect. At the same time, to speak to what you were saying, we need to develop in order to adapt to that. That's not happening. I mean, largely not happening. And when I say it's not happening in a mainstream way. It's definitely happening outside of mainstream. There's no doubt about that. People are preparing, thinking about it, etc. But mainstream, we're still being pretty much distraction is a huge tactic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a huge tactic, and we know why. So that's a big thing. So part of the nonviolent, disobedient, the movement it's not really a rigid part of it, but there is a community, a loose community, is that the values the training we do, the values we have, is quite thorough, to put it. And it's interesting because one of the people who's been involved in that and is kind of guiding this once said to me, he said, this kind of radical protest is transformative. And Thomas, I've witnessed that, because part of what moved me was I am 3/4, hopefully, through my life. I've had an amazing life. I've had a very privileged in the sense that I've had a lot of freedom. I've lived in better times. I've had a lot of challenges too. Obviously, we all have. But I see young people giving up their careers, giving up their lives because they feel desperate, they feel impotent, and joining this movement. And I feel there's something deeply wrong when your youth have to go to that extreme, to glue themselves to a road, for example, to attract the attention. The reason for doing that is to attract the attention of the media in order to bring the topic to discussion, which it has done. I have to say it's been very effective here in Britain. Because it's not just the act in the newspaper headlines. The conversation starts in all the newsrooms and the talk shows, and we now have young people very adept at talking about the issue there. So it's done a lot here in Britain. In fact, yeah. So ahead.
To one sentence that you brought, and I think it's just maybe the central sentence is that radical activism is transformative.
Yes.
Why and how?
Right. Well, to engage in that, you have to be highly motivated. And I think what people are really motivated by this is care. They really care. And they feel compelled by a moral conscience, I have to say. There's not a lot one gets out of it in other ways, but there's I think you're responding to a part of yourself. And I know that was in my case. I've often thought, where would I have been during the 30s in Germany? Where would I have been at certain times in history when things were happening socially and politically? And I felt I needed to, and I know all the people I know in this movement felt compelled to actually to bring this topic out in all its complexity and simplicity. And it is, Thomas, because you have to submit to an incredible discipline. You have to be very disciplined. You learn to be very disciplined in terms of your own emotions. It's motivated by love. It's not motivated by anger. I haven't met one angry person yet, activist. I'm not saying there aren't any, but not someone who's motivated by anger. They're motivated by love, by the compulsion to want to make a difference. The other thing is there's a lot of sacrifice. As I said, young people are giving up their careers, they're giving up their university degrees, and a lot of these people, it's interesting, are from North England, and they're not from very wealthy backgrounds. The ability to be able to be on a road and inevitably cause disruption. You're going to face people on the street who are angry. The ability to let go and surrender to that, and to have a capacity to feel empathy for them, which people do because we know it's disruptive, but to know very deeply why you are doing this. And be able to express that. So it transforms. And I now have witnessed and seen young people in prison writing poetry. There's one young man who's been 7 or 8 months in prison on remand, hasn't even got to trial yet. He is just broadcasting through a phone from his prison cell, love, Thomas. And he is an inspiration because it's being transmitted to young activist groups across Europe and America. And it's inspiring to them. It's not a message of doom. It's a message of love, frankly. And I see these people change. And I've felt myself. The other one thing you have to do is you have to cross boundaries in yourself. And as you know, a spiritual practice, it's about stepping into the unknown. So you have to cross boundaries. And I didn't even know I had a boundary of obedience to the state. So you have to have a very strong motivation for something bigger than yourself. So
no, I completely understand that. And I also can see just a very simple fact, particular for young people, that you give up your career, let's say so, for something that you feel a deep existential urgency for. Just this choice, basically, to give up for some higher value,
that's
something that will probably give you a lot of security and comfort in your life, because it will give you a good income. So that needs at least some moral stand, if not more a kind of spiritual stand of love for something.
Yes.
I can see that. There is, of course, the counter argument, that there is also a kind of the danger of kind of self-righteousness and creating something where fighting for the ideal, you create the higher moral grounds, and you identify, particularly when you're talking from a spiritual stance, basically the ego grabs that very fast, and basically you are saving the world. There's all kind of traps built into this.
Definitely.
Let's put it that way. And in Germany, there is the discussion, of course, this is also led by the mainstream media, kind of putting on the wall the danger of eco-terrorism.
Yes.
And kind of being concerned that there's a radicalization that leads to something like a second wave of terrorist culture, like the Red Army fraction that came out of the '68 movement. So I'm not saying that this is happening, but I can see that there are dynamics that could support something in that. And I'm just curious, the people involved, also the people who have a voice in that, how aware are they of this, and how are they dealing with this, so that this is on a personal and group level something that is transformative in a positive way, that it biggens the heart, it biggens the mind, it enlarges your perspectives.
Well, it's interesting, and I can't speak for, because it's really not one monolithic movement. I want to say that. So what you're speaking about, I'm very aware could happen. It hasn't, as far as I know, happened here, and I'm fairly familiar. It's a fairly small group, really, a few hundred people. And then there's waves of young students who came through over the summer. So I can only really speak from the British part of it. And there is always that, Thomas, and there is always the danger of, self-identification, and as you said, moral righteousness, and that can happen for sure. But it's very interesting, the culture within that I've been part of, because there's a lot of Zoom calls, there's a lot of online interaction between. There's that is, I would say, not discouraged in a prescribed way, but it's certainly not part of it's something that people acknowledge can happen. It's there, but what I've seen is it hasn't been an attractor to people in this movement. I'm quite surprised at the spiritual maturity of people who haven't necessarily had the spiritual training. And what I say by that is, some of these people do extraordinary things. There's a young, I'll give example, a young engineer who, along with another engineer, went on top of this very high bridge in Britain and hung a big poster, hung a big flag up there with "Just Stop Oil" written on it. Now Morgan is writing poetry from beautiful poetry from prison that he sends off. He doesn't know even when his trial is. He's in there a long time. There's also a surrender to that. Now, what I want to say is there's no celebritization of him. People appreciate, but that I've been very struck by. It's not, and I'm not saying no one has that. I'm sure there's pockets where that's going on, but it's not within the sort of field where we commonly communicate. And it's not when you go out on a team, it's not there either. I'm really surprised at, there's a young man, Louis McKechnie, he's become a sort of icon for a football team. He went on, and he's a very humble person. And I think, I don't know why, but I think the ambience, the sort of it being grounded in nonviolent disobedience, and very much relating, everyone's very aware too of the global South, how these movements have been operating there for years. Mm-hmm. This is not, a new movement. There's a lot of humility about that we're standing on the shoulders, and a lot of awareness as well. People are very well informed about the history of how we got here, etc. So this could happen, Thomas. I'm not saying it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And the radicalization in terms of eco-terrorism, gluing one's hand to the is really a delay tactic. I just want to say, it sounds incredibly radical, and it is. First time you do it, it is. But it really is a delay tactic. It takes place a few more minutes to get you off, so that the press, and it's not just for some narcissistic press moment, but so the press record the event, and then it will go further out, and as I said, be discussed in more depth in other fora. But I just want to say these actions are designed to have minimum disruption. They don't look like that, but they're planned to such a degree, including what we call the blue light policy, letting those through, including having de-escalators, which I've done, where you're talking to the public. All of these things are there, including how you relate to the police, including how you respond to. They're designed to be maximally disruptive in order to raise attention, but minimally disruptive. Because it's hard to do that. Everyone feels that. It's very hard. When you're actually sitting on the road, you feel quite conflicted, to be honest, on a human level. So I haven't seen these developments in Britain, at least, but I'm not saying they'll never come. And yeah.
Let me also ask on the other side of this transformative question, because when we talk about radical activism being transformative, there are two sides that I can see. One is talking about the individual and the group transformation, which I can see, and we just talked about the dangers. And the other is, of course, also the question, how does this transform culture and society? Is this a transformative practice? Or is it maybe even a practice that becomes a boomerang because it kind of creates barriers that haven't been there before? And to be honest, I'm back and forth with this question, and I just want to hear from you, because on one hand, I just deeply can understand that in a situation where on one hand the media and consciousness industry is deeply primed to keep course in our modernist capitalist
right.
It's one, but that's only one part of it. There's also our cultural kind of being on the same on the same lane, and our lives, our careers, our whatever thought systems are all connected to that. And it's obvious, at least I would claim so, that the science is clear that what I said at the beginning, we are at a point beyond repair. Something has to stop both the consciousness industry and the cultural consciousness. And for that, just saying again nicely, please think about it, obvious does not help. So disruption,
yes,
if it's controversial, does something different.
Exactly.
And I do understand, although it may alienate at this point,
yes,
at the same time, it maybe also will penetrate.
Definitely. And I would say, yeah.
That's the one side. And the other side is, again, a fine line where you basically alienate all those people who have also to change their own understandings and their own leanings because they feel provoked in a way that doesn't take them with you.
Yes.
With you, but basically aligns them with the power it plays.
Yes.
I'm sure that there must be a lot of conversations about
there is.
the delicacy of this question.
There is
this conversation.
There definitely is. And thanks for, this is really the nub of it, I think. And there's even here a big movement about those that are advocating what they call the moderate flank, which is more orientated to bringing people on board in the way you're saying. And then the more radical flank, which I want to say, I'm not talking about eco-terrorism here, but I'm talking about people that are willing to cross those boundaries, go to prison, but not be violent. And I'm not talking about not just not being violent. I'm talking about a deep surrender to something, to the to love, really, to why you're doing this. So that's a practice in itself. There are practices, but just to say, Thomas, I think at this point, the way where I've come to this and a lot of the movement in these conversations is that, yes, usually radical, effective, nonviolent movements in the past have not been popular at the time, none of them. And even the violent ones like the suffragettes, who they weren't, they were very unpopular at the time, but they had a big impact. And later on, they're viewed very differently because they're viewed within the context of the time. Whereas the press, largely, apart from the Guardian here, but the Financial Times, I have to say, the Times is starting to review some of its negative perceptions of us, of what's happened, because they see change happening. But just to say, there is a constant conversation. I think it needs to be a constant one, because I think you need both. You need to bring people forward, and Extinction Rebellion is going more in that direction of reaching out, being more temperate. And I would say where I'm aligned with right now, I'm part of, because you need people, and part of why I'm doing it, Thomas, is there aren't a lot of people to do it. And I feel, well, if not me, who? And I'm not saying everyone should do it. I absolutely don't. I think it's a calling. It's something like, it's a spiritual calling, actually. And it's not something that I see myself, it's not all I see myself as. I'm writing, I'm doing all the activities and engagements, and with all the groups I was before, this is one thread. But just to say that we are going to alienate people, we do, but the more conversations, the more press, and when I say press, I mean conversations like we're having with people involved that are public, people begin to go, oh, maybe there's more to this, maybe these people, and I want to say that there is an element of being willing, of the power of sacrifice and the power of example. And I'm not talking about myself at this point, but I have seen how people willing to go to prison for something higher, free of anger, still expressing a love and a care, because none of these people, I want to say, actually think we can't have an effect. As I said, I don't think we're going to turn, we've gone too far to turn events completely, but we can ameliorate it and we can stop the harm. So I often see this as triage too. We've got to stop the harm, or it's going to be way worse than it will be anyway. And I think that's a critically important thing. And as I said to you in the beginning, we're not there yet. That hasn't happened. It needs to happen. So I think you need both, but I think the radical, and that's why I'm quite vocal. I'm very vocal within our group. There's a very good culture of questioning things. That's the article I wrote about. It's obviously permeated by postmodern and even metamodern influences. It's very non-hierarchical and non-prescriptive. People are very autonomous. I have to say, you can't be in there as a follower. You have to, because if you're alone in a prison cell, you are going to be relying on yourself, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have to know why you're doing it. So I feel both of those, and I think the fact that it is risking and it is alienating certain people, that's for sure, and sometimes a lot. If you look at the press, it looks like a lot. But as there was a BBC environmental consultant for 20 years, his name's Roger Harriban, he said during the Insulate Britain, he said, what was achieved in 2 months, I could not achieve in 20 years, meaning the raising of the topic into consciousness here. So, yeah, it's a difficult one. And as you said, it's the core of conversation.
Let me bring in also a third dimension of transformation that is easily overseen and from my perspective lies in between the two that we have talked about, and which I found very intriguing. In fact, I heard about when I heard about you being in prison and being a trial, and the conscious thoughts about how your attitude and the way you are and what you are for on trial changes the people in the law system, the lawyers, the judges, the people who treat you in prison. Similar, I assume, that journalists who have to report about you are being involved not only with your arguments, but with your humanness.
Exactly.
Are exposed to something, and this I find this very fascinating, because it has a consciousness spiritual dimension to it. This is not about just the bad arguments. This is about the depth of humanness, and also how we influence us as humans.
Yes.
In
absolutely.
Our humanness, and that there's humanness on all sides, and the trust in that, and the trust in the transformative power.
Yes.
If I may say it in a blind way, of the good, the true, and the beautiful in our souls. And that is something that I find is a very powerful way of thinking about transformation.
Yes. Well, everything you spoke about is definitely part of this. It's true. I don't know, Thomas, how many. I'm just going to start with the people I've engaged with: public, police, guards, ushers, court ushers, judges. And I'm just talking about myself, but you can magnify that. There is, I was just attending 2 trials recently with a very, very difficult judge. He took away every possible argument. He put them outside the parameter of the ruling. So you couldn't even mention climate change. You couldn't mention intention. You couldn't mention motivational context. Two of those trials were given a non-guilty verdict. Miraculous, for exactly the reason you're talking about. Because there were 4 defendants in each. They spoke so authentically, with such transparency, such humanness, that the jury were affected, because the prosecutor had they weren't denying they were there, et cetera, and they weren't even able to frame it within the context that they were. So it has a power. It really does. And I think when you have a small group of people, yes, they can be, sort of a lot of negative publicity, but it is having an effect. And I have seen police officers, when they realize we're not looking to just get out of prison, or we're just getting, that we're actually doing this for a purpose. And the courts are a very important forum for this. And because the judiciary, I've learned, is not well educated in the climate crisis or the ecological. They're not. Of course, they know what we know from reading the papers, but they haven't connected the dots necessarily. So they're learning a lot themselves. So the court is a forum for our humanity, transparency. It's where I think the issues of the day, with all their depth, are on display. And the other day, I came out. I was in the gallery, and when we got the non-verdict, it was amazing, Thomas, because the feeling then, I was amazed how deeply I was moved, because you feel there's justice operating outside. These are not criminals. We're not criminals. There's a reason this, and imprisoning those that are simply raising the flag and going, hey, there is an issue here. We have to make changes. And it's all very reasonable, that the changes that are made, right, that they're actually reasonable. For those people to be shut up is becoming a difficult thing for our society, I think, and for the judges and for the juries and I think it's the pure, as you said, it's the sheer humanity, the love and conviction, which largely, I wouldn't say completely, and funnily enough, one of the most public faces of these, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, is probably more ideological than anyone in the movement, Roger Hallam. And everyone knows that. That's the other thing I saw. People hold it very lightly. They know that's him, and it doesn't define what people do. So, yeah, it's a deeply human movement. And I've seen, I was in a prison van. I have to just tell you this very briefly. People escorting you. I had a vicar who was with me. There was a couple of others. And I think one of the police officers must have been Roman Catholic. He was fascinated. And he called his wife and said, you will not believe it, I'm escorting a vicar to the court. And but in talking and conversation, I've had, I can't even remember, I think how many conversations with police officers, often young, when they understand what we're doing, why we're doing, and many have claimed too, they really don't know that much, the kind of transformation that happens. So the more and more, Thomas, you have a nucleus of people that are honestly embodying something, not just a radical message, as you said, but embodying something different. It starts to have an impact. The ushers at the courthouse at the other came out and hugged the defendants. They shouldn't have done that, but they did, the court ushers. So there's some very moving things. And just to say one other, they have these sort of dungeon-like cells beneath the High Court that you come from when you come from prison. You're in these sort of dungeon-like cells. They're very rough. And I was in there for quite a long time waiting to go up. And this young one, and you're not allowed out at all for anything, but they'll bring you tea and water, etc. And when one of the young guards there brought me tea, he said, can you explain your objective? And I said, you mean my objective or the movement, the movement? And he said, no, the movement, what's it about? And so I very briefly, because we had very little time, explained. And I can feel the change in his consciousness. And, I don't mean this in any sort of self-elevating way, but I felt his respect. He wasn't just for me, it was for something that he saw happening that he began to understand. So just to say that, it's quite it can have a transformative effect in many ways, on many levels.
No, I see that, and it is powerful. Let me put it on a probe, though.
Again. Yes, no, do.
Again.
Yeah, that's why we're here.
Obviously, this is very powerful, what you're describing. Isn't there also the danger to create some self-heroic bubble where you have this response from the judge, where you have the response from the policeman, and you feel, and basically there's something where something happens in a minor way, but basically it doesn't really make that difference.
No.
Then one feels that one has done something, and I'm really saying that to also question that part.
No, it's
bring that danger in, because yeah, there are traps at all sides.
There are traps on all sides. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And I think one of the all I can say is that I've been struck by the absence of that. No, I just have. I think people are far too concerned about the reality of the situation. Also, people are dealing with a lot of the other families who don't, you know, the people in bit more, you know, sort of conservative villages who are no longer spoken to by the villagers. So there's a lot on the other side too, right? As you brought up. But I think, Thomas, that I'm not saying that's not, of course, that's a possibility, but I have not witnessed that. And I think part of it is the weight of the concern about the situation. It's much bigger than any one of us. And I think also there's an awareness that, as I said before, this is one thread of many that have to happen, right? It's not the thread. Some, I have to speak to Roger Hallam, maybe presents that, but a lot of people that I know are very aware. They consider this a very important thread, and we do need people to come, because there's only so much time you can continue to do this. Things build up and accumulate, right? And you know, time in prison, et cetera, but I think there's a great respect for other movements, for other things that are happening, and an awareness that this is there's a tapestry of different threads that are needed, but they're all fueled, I think. It's been by this understanding that we need a new culture, we need a shift in our cultural values, we need a shift of consciousness. And many in this movement are also from other movements. They're from the regenerative movement, the agri, a lot of them organic, you know, they come from different, some of them have worked in the environmental, you know, as environmental scientists, some are students, some are construction workers. I mean, they're from all over, actually. But I haven't seen that. And I think it's partly because there's so much attention on what needs to happen. And the other thing, just to say, there is an awareness when we're together or we're going out in an action that we're kind of co-creating a culture as we go. So there is a carefulness in that. I feel that acts as a kind of self-reflector, you know, a point of self-reflection.
Mary, thank you for that. Thank you for what you're doing. I think it's important.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for your questions. It's very important, I think.